Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Monty Hall Problem. A game show host presents three doors. Behind one is a valuable prize, a car perhaps, and behind the other two are less desirable outcomes, goats or some other consolation, and the contestant chooses a door, say, door number 1, but before the chosen door is opened, the host, who knows what is behind each door, opens one of the other doors, revealing a goat, and now 2 doors remain closed. The one the contestant originally chose, and one other. And the host offers a choice, stick with the original selection or switch to the other unopened door. And the question that has baffled and frustrated countless people is simple. Does it matter? Is there an advantage to switching? And the answer, counterintuitive as it seems, is yes. Switching doubles the probability of winning, changing the odds from 1 in 3 to 2 in 3. And this result violates most people's intuitions. Seems wrong? Feels like it cannot be right, yet it is mathematically certain. And this is the Monty Hall Problem, named after the host of the American television game show Let's Make a Deal, a puzzle, improbability that reveals how poorly human intuition handles conditional probability and how easily we can be misled by seemingly simple scenarios. The reasoning behind the correct answer goes as follows. When the contestant first chooses a door, the probability that the prize is behind that door is 1 in 3, and the probability that it is behind one of the other 2 doors is 2 in 3. And this much is uncontroversial. But when the host opens one of the other doors and reveals a goat, showing that the prize is not behind that door, the probabilities do not redistribute evenly among the remaining doors. The original choice still has a 1 in 3 probability of being correct, because the host's action did not change the fact that the contestant's initial choice was made with 1 in 3 odds. But the other unopened door now has a 2 in 3 probability, because the 2 in 3 chance that was distributed across the 2 unchosen doors is now concentrated in the single remaining door, and so switching to that door doubles the chance of winning. The intuition that misleads most people is the idea that once one door is opened and eliminated, there are 2 doors left, and the prize is equally likely to be behind either, giving a 50-50 chance regardless of whether you switch. But this reasoning ignores the information provided by the host's action, the fact that the host deliberately chose to open a door with a goat. And this deliberate choice is not random, it is constrained by knowledge. The host cannot open the door with the prize and will not open the door the contestant chose. And so the host's action provides information that updates the probabilities in a non-obvious way. A useful way to see why switching is advantageous is to imagine a version of the game with 1,000,000 doors. The contestant chooses one door, which has a 1 in a million chance of having the prize, and then the host opens 999,998 of the other doors, all showing goats, leaving only the contestant's original choice and one other door. And now it seems clear that the contestant's original choice, made with 1 in a million odds, is almost certainly wrong. And the remaining door, the one the host carefully avoided opening, is almost certainly the one with the prize, and switching gives a 999,999 in a million chance of winning. And the same principle applies with 3 doors, just with less dramatic numbers. The Monty Hall Problem has been a source of controversy and heated debate, even among mathematicians and statisticians. And when Marilyn Vos Savant, a columnist known for her high IQ, published the correct answer in her magazine column in 1990, she received thousands of letters, many from PhD holders and professionals, insisting she was wrong. And the controversy revealed how deeply counterintuitive the solution is, how resistant people are to accepting it even when presented with mathematical proof. And this resistance reflects broader features of human cognition. The tendency to rely on heuristics and intuitions that work well in most everyday situations, but fail in probabilistic scenarios involving conditional information. The problem also illustrates the importance of conditioning in probability, the fact that probabilities must be updated in light of new information, and that the way information is acquired matters. The host's knowledge and deliberate choice of which door to open is crucial to the solution. If the host opened a door randomly and happened to reveal a goat, then the probabilities would indeed be 50-50. But because the host knows and deliberately avoids the prize door, the situation is different. And this distinction between random and informed selection is subtle and easy to miss. The Monty Hall problem has applications beyond game shows. It appears in medical testing, in legal reasoning, in machine learning, anywhere that probabilities must be updated based on partial information. And understanding the logic of the Monty Hall problem helps clarify how to reason correctly in these more consequential contexts, how to avoid fallacies, how to properly incorporate evidence into probability assessments. The problem also raises questions about the psychology of probability, about why people find certain probabilistic reasoning so difficult. And experiments have shown that even after being told the correct answer and shown simulations that demonstrate it, many people remain skeptical, unable to shake the intuition that switching makes no difference. And this persistence of false intuition, despite evidence, suggests that probabilistic thinking is not natural to humans, that we evolved in environments where simple heuristics like equiprobability were sufficient, and that the kind of careful conditional reasoning required by the Monty Hall problem is a learned skill that requires training and practice. The doors stand closed, one hides the prize, the host knows which. The contestant chooses. The host opens a door, reveals a goat, and offers the choice. And the decision, which seems inconsequential, which feels like a coin flip, is actually a test of probabilistic reasoning, a puzzle that most people get wrong, that defies intuition, that reveals the gap between how we think probability works and how it actually works. And the Monty Hall problem endures, a staple of probability courses, a cautionary tale about trusting intuition, a reminder that the world is full of situations where the obvious answer is wrong, where careful analysis reveals unexpected structure, where what seems like chance is actually determined by hidden information, and the contestant who switches, who overcomes intuition and follows the mathematics, walks away with the prize twice as often, and the contestant who sticks with the original choice, trusting gut instinct, wins only a third of the time. And the difference, the doubling of odds, is not a trick or a gimmick, but a genuine feature of how conditional probability operates, and the problem persists, puzzling new generations, frustrating those who encounter it, illuminating those who understand it. A small puzzle with large implications. A game show scenario that contains lessons about reasoning, evidence, and the limits of human intuition. The origination paradox, why you cannot create yourself. A philosopher asks where free will comes from. What makes a choice truly free, truly yours? And the answer seems to require that you be the ultimate source of your choices, that your decisions originate with you rather than being caused by factors beyond your control. And this origination, this ultimate sourcehood, seems necessary for responsibility, because if your choices are caused by factors you did not create, by genes you did not choose, by environments you did not design, by prior causes that reach back before your birth, then how are you responsible for those choices? How are they truly yours? And yet origination seems impossible, seems to require that you create yourself, that you choose your own character before you have a character to make choices with. And this is the origination paradox, the problem that free will seems to require ultimate origination, ultimate sourcehood, being the first cause of your actions, but such origination is impossible, requires creating yourself from nothing, requires existing before you exist to make the choices that create you. And this impossibility suggests that free will, understood as requiring ultimate origination, is impossible, is an incoherent concept, and responsibility is problematic. And this paradox has driven many philosophers to conclude that free will, in the strong libertarian sense, does not exist, cannot exist, and the most we can have is a weaker compatibilist freedom that does not require ultimate origination. Imagine trying to be the ultimate source of your actions, trying to take complete responsibility for what you do, and you trace back the causes of your action. Your action was caused by your decision. Your decision was caused by your desires and beliefs. Your desires and beliefs were caused by your experiences and your innate psychology. Your innate psychology was caused by your genes and early development. Your genes were caused by your parents, and the causal chain extends back before your existence. And at no point in this chain did you create the causes. At no point did you originate the factors that shaped you. And so you are not the ultimate source of your actions. You are a link in a causal chain that extends beyond you. And if responsibility requires ultimate origination, then you are not responsible because you did not originate yourself, did not create the character from which your choices flow. The origination paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. To be ultimately responsible for an action, you must be ultimately responsible for how you are, for your character, your values, your psychology, because your action flows from how you are, and to be ultimately responsible for how you are. You must have chosen to be that way, but to choose to be a certain way, you must already have some character, some values, some psychology to make the choice with, and this prior character must itself have been chosen if you are to be ultimately responsible for it. And this leads to an infinite regress. You must have chosen your character. Before choosing your character, must have existed before you existed to create yourself. And this is impossible. And so ultimate responsibility, ultimate origination is impossible. And if free will requires it, then free will is impossible. Visualize the regress to be responsible for action. A, you must be responsible for character C that caused A, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for earlier character CE that caused C, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for even earlier character C, and so on infinitely. And the regress cannot be completed, cannot be grounded, because there is no first character that you chose, no original act of self-creation. And so the chain of responsibility has no beginning, hangs unsupported, and ultimate responsibility collapses. And with it collapses free will understood as requiring ultimate origination. This argument, developed by Galen Strawson and others, is meant to show that libertarian free will understood as requiring ultimate sourcehood, is impossible, is incoherent. And this drives the debate toward compatibilism, toward the view that free will does not require ultimate origination, but only requires that actions flow from the agent's own psychology, from their desires and values, even if those desires and values were themselves caused by factors beyond the agent's control. And compatibilism avoids the origination paradox by weakening the requirements for freedom, by denying that ultimate origination is necessary. One response to the origination paradox accepts it, accepts that ultimate responsibility is impossible, and embraces the conclusion that no one is truly responsible in the ultimate sense. And this view, sometimes called hard incompatibilism, denies both that we have libertarian free will and that compatibilist freedom is sufficient for genuine responsibility. And moral responsibility is an illusion, is a concept that cannot be sustained once we recognize the impossibility of ultimate origination, and we should replace responsibility with other concepts, with forward-looking considerations about consequences and prevention rather than backward-looking considerations about desert and blame. Another response argues that ultimate origination is not necessary for responsibility, that responsibility requires only proximate origination, being the proximate cause of action, the immediate source. And as long as your action flows from your own deliberation, your own character, you are responsible, even if your character was shaped by prior causes, even if you are not the ultimate source. And proximate origination is sufficient for the kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the origination paradox shows only that ultimate responsibility is impossible, not that ordinary responsibility is impossible, and we should not let the impossible standard of ultimate origination undermine the possible standard of proximate origination. A third response from agent causation theories argues that persons are uncaused causes, are agents who can initiate causal chains without being caused to initiate them. And agent causation is a special kind of causation, different from event causation, where events cause events and agents, as substances, have the power to cause events without being caused to exercise that power. And this avoids the regress because the agent does not need to cause themselves, does not need prior character to act, but can act directly as an uncaused cause. And this preserves ultimate origination by making agents first causes. But critics argue that agent causation is mysterious, unexplained, involves a kind of causation that seems inconsistent with naturalism, seems like magic, and the theory creates more problems than it solves. The origination paradox also connects to debates about moral luck, about whether we can be responsible for factors beyond our control, because the paradox shows that if we trace back far enough, everything is beyond our control, everything is luck, is the product of factors we did not choose, and if we cannot be responsible for luck, then we cannot be responsible for anything. And this conclusion, while following from the paradox, seems too extreme, seems to eliminate responsibility entirely. And this drives some philosophers to accept moral luck, to accept that we can be responsible for actions that depend on factors beyond our control. That responsibility does not require eliminating luck, but only requires certain kinds of control, certain kinds of connection between agent and action. The philosopher asks where you came from, how you became the person you are, and the answer traces back through causes, through genes and upbringing and choices and experiences. And none of these origins were ultimately under your control. None were self-created, and so you are not self-caused, are not self-created, are not the ultimate origination of yourself. And if responsibility requires self-creation, then you are not responsible, and the origination paradox stands as a permanent challenge to libertarian theories of free will, shows that ultimate origination is impossible, shows that we cannot be the uncaused first causes of ourselves, and whether this impossibility undermines all responsibility or only ultimate responsibility remains contested, and the paradox persists, a challenge to the idea that we are truly the authors of our actions, truly the originators of our choices, and the causal chain extends back, and you stand in the middle, caused by the past, causing the future, and where you came from. Who created you? The answer is no one. You emerged from causes, were shaped by forces, and the origination was not yours, was nature's, was the universe's, and whether this makes you unfree, makes responsibility impossible, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will, and the origination paradox endures, impossible to solve, impossible to escape, a permanent reminder that self-creation is impossible, and ultimate origination is a fantasy, and what we are left with is proximate origination, being the immediate cause of actions, being the link through which causes flow, and whether this is enough for freedom remains the central question, and the paradox stands stark and unavoidable, showing that we did not create ourselves, cannot create ourselves, and yet must live and choose and be responsible somehow. The paradox of fiction, why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief, and yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred. And if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions, despite the audience knowing it is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy, and normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim, argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief, can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception. A mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real. And various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives, regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens, the film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist, and the tears are real even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion and fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The paradox of power. Why having power makes you lose it. A leader gains power through competence, through understanding others' needs, through empathy and social intelligence, through building coalitions and reading situations accurately. And these qualities enable the rise to power, enable winning support, enable navigating social hierarchies, and the leader reaches positions of authority, gains control over resources, gains ability to make decisions affecting others, and then something changes. The experience of having power alters the psychology of the powerful, reduces empathy, reduces perspective taking, increases confidence, increases risk taking, and these changes are the opposite of what brought power, are the erosion of the very qualities that enabled gaining power. And this is the paradox of power, described by psychologist Daché Keltner and others. The finding that power changes people, makes them less attuned to others, less socially intelligent, less effective at the behaviours that won them power, and powerful people become entitled, become overconfident, become less accurate in reading social situations. And these changes lead to misuse of power, lead to decisions that harm subordinates, lead to loss of support, and eventually lead to loss of power itself. And the paradox shows that power contains the seeds of its own destruction, that having power undermines the qualities necessary to maintain power. And this cycle explains the rise and fall of leaders, explains why initial competence gives way to corruption or incompetence, explains why power corrupts. And the paradox has implications for understanding leadership, for recognizing that power is dangerous, that maintaining power requires deliberate effort to preserve the qualities that win power, requires resistance to the psychological effects of having power. Imagine the psychological changes that occur when someone gains power, gains control, gains authority, and research shows that power activates the behavioral approach system, increases focus on rewards, increases willingness to take risks, and simultaneously, power deactivates the behavioral inhibition system, reduces attention to threats, reduces concern about others' reactions, and these changes make powerful people more action-oriented, more decisive, but also less careful, less considerate. And experiments demonstrate this, show that people primed to feel powerful are more likely to interrupt others, to speak out of turn, to violate social norms, to take what they want without considering others, and powerful people literally see less, attend less to others' emotions, are worse at identifying facial expressions, are less accurate in reading social cues. And this reduced social intelligence is ironic because social intelligence is what typically wins power, is what enables navigating social hierarchies, and power reduces the very capacity that was necessary to gain it. The paradox of power demonstrates that power is self-undermining, that the experience of having power changes people in ways that make them worse at wielding power, that the psychological effects of power include overconfidence, reduced empathy, increased risk-taking, reduced constraint, and these effects lead to mistakes, lead to alienating subordinates, lead to poor decisions, and eventually lead to loss of power. And the cycle repeats. New leaders rise through empathy and social intelligence, gain power, lose these qualities, make mistakes, lose power. And the paradox is that the qualities needed to gain power are different from or opposite to the psychological effects of having power. And this mismatch drives the cycle, drives the rise and fall of leaders. And preventing the cycle requires awareness, requires powerful people to recognize the psychological effects of power and deliberately compensate, deliberately maintain empathy, deliberately attend to others, deliberately resist the natural effects of power. Visualize the paradox as a feedback loop. Gaining power reduces empathy. Reduced empathy leads to poor decisions. Poor decisions alienate supporters. Alienated supporters withdraw support. Withdrawn support leads to loss of power, and the loop is negative, is self-reinforcing, is a cycle that drives powerful people toward downfall. And breaking the loop requires intervention, requires powerful people to resist the psychological effects of power, requires institutional checks that constrain power, requires cultures that maintain accountability, and without such mechanisms, the loop runs its course. Power leads to its own destruction, and the paradox unfolds. One mechanism underlying the paradox is the disinhibition effect, the finding that power reduces inhibition, reduces self-regulation, reduces the internal constraints that normally prevent people from acting on impulses, and powerful people feel freer to do what they want. Feel less constrained by social norms, feel less concerned about consequences, and this freedom can be positive, can enable decisive action, can overcome excessive caution, but it also leads to inappropriate behavior, leads to violations of norms, leads to taking advantage of others, and the disinhibition effect explains many abuses of power, explains why powerful people harass subordinates, why they take liberties, why they feel entitled, and the effect is not intentional malice, but is psychological change caused by having power, is reduced inhibition that allows latent tendencies to manifest. Another mechanism is the decreased perspective taking, the finding that power reduces the ability and motivation to understand others' perspectives, to imagine how situations look from others' viewpoints, and powerful people focus on their own goals, their own needs, and pay less attention to others. And this reduced perspective taking makes powerful people worse at negotiation, worse at building consensus, worse at understanding how their actions affect others, and these deficits undermine effectiveness, undermine leadership, and create the conditions for losing power. And the paradox is complete. Power reduces the social intelligence needed to maintain power. One response to the paradox is institutional design, creating checks on power, creating accountability mechanisms, creating regular reviews or elections that force powerful people to maintain support. And democratic systems embody this, have regular elections that remove leaders who lose support, and corporate boards have review processes. And these institutions mitigate the paradox by making power conditional, by requiring continued demonstration of competence, by preventing the complacency that power breeds. And effective institutions recognize the paradox, recognize that power corrupts, and design around it, create structures that limit the damage caused by the psychological effects of power. Another response is leadership development, training leaders to recognize the paradox, to understand the psychological effects of power, to deliberately maintain empathy and perspective taking. And research shows that awareness helps, that leaders who understand the paradox are better at resisting its effects, are more likely to maintain the qualities that won them power. And leadership training increasingly includes content about the psychology of power, about the importance of humility, about the need to deliberately attend to others despite the psychological pull towards self-focus. And this training aims to break the cycle, aims to help powerful people resist the natural effects of power. A third response is cultural, creating organizational cultures that value empathy, that reward perspective taking, that punish abuse of power. And some organizations succeed at this, create environments where power does not corrupt, where leaders remain accountable, remain connected to subordinates. And these cultures require work, require deliberate effort to maintain, require norms that constrain power, that make abuse costly, and they require exemplars, require leaders who model healthy use of power, who demonstrate that power can be wielded without corruption. And these cultural interventions show that the paradox is not inevitable, is not deterministic, but can be managed through collective effort. The paradox also connects to ancient wisdom, to the recognition across cultures and eras that power corrupts, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that leaders must guard against the temptations of power. And philosophers from Plato to Confucius recognized the paradox, recognized that power changes people, and their advice remains relevant. remains a warning that power is dangerous, that vigilance is necessary, that humility is essential, and the paradox of power shows that this ancient wisdom is psychologically accurate, is confirmed by modern research, is not merely moral preaching, but is description of how power actually affects people. The leader rises, gains authority, controls resources, makes decisions, and power begins its work, reduces empathy, increases overconfidence, loosens inhibitions, and the leader becomes less effective, less attuned, more self-focused, makes mistakes, alienates supporters, and the fall begins, and the paradox completes its arc. Power undermines itself. The qualities that won power are lost, and new leaders rise to repeat the cycle, and the paradox of power endures as a permanent feature of leadership, as a psychological reality that must be managed, that must be resisted, that must be constrained through institutions and culture and awareness. And the paradox remains inevitable and destructive unless deliberately countered, unless powerful people recognize the effects and fight them, unless societies build structures that limit the damage and the cycle continues. The rise and fall driven by the paradox that having power undermines the ability to keep it. The paradox of thrift. Saving money is virtuous, or so conventional wisdom holds. The careful individual who sets aside a portion of income, who resists the temptation to spend frivolously, who builds reserves against uncertain futures, is praised for responsibility and prudence. And yet there exists a paradox, articulated by economists and popularized by John Maynard Keynes, which suggests that if everyone tries to save more at the same time, the collective result is not increased wealth but decreased income, not prosperity but recession. And this is the paradox of thrift, a situation where individually rational behavior leads to collectively irrational outcomes, where virtue practiced universally becomes vice. The mechanism of the paradox operates through the relationship between spending and income in an economy, because one person's spending is another person's income. When you buy goods or services, you transfer money to the seller, who uses that money to pay employees and suppliers, who in turn spend it on other goods and services. And this circular flow of spending sustains employment and production. And if many people simultaneously decide to save more and spend less, then aggregate demand falls, businesses see reduced sales and respond by cutting production and laying off workers, and those who lose jobs or see reduced hours have less income, which forces them to reduce spending further, which causes more businesses to cut back. And this feedback loop drives the economy into recession, and in the recession, people earn less income, which means that despite their desire to save more, they may end up saving the same amount or even less than before because their incomes have fallen, and so the collective attempt to increase savings fails, defeated by the macroeconomic dynamics it sets in motion. The paradox challenges the microeconomic intuition that saving is always beneficial, that thrift is a virtue without qualification, and it reveals a divergence between individual rationality and collective welfare, a situation where what is good for each person taken separately is bad for everyone taken together. And this kind of divergence appears throughout economics, in the tragedy of the commons where individual overuse of shared resources leads to collective depletion, in the prisoner's dilemma where individual defection leads to mutually harmful outcomes, and in coordination failures where the inability to synchronize actions produces inefficiency. Keynes used the paradox of thrift to argue for government intervention during economic downturns, suggesting that when private sector spending collapses, the government should step in and increase public spending, running deficits if necessary to maintain aggregate demand and prevent the economy from spiraling into depression. And this idea became a cornerstone of Keynesian economics, influencing policy responses to recessions for decades, though it remains controversial, with critics arguing that government spending is inefficient, that deficits impose costs on future generations, that markets are self-correcting and will eventually restore full employment without intervention, and that the paradox of thrift does not apply in the long run because savings finance investment, which increases productive capacity and future income. The debate over the paradox of thrift touches on fundamental questions about how economies function, whether they are naturally stable or prone to instability, whether markets can coordinate the actions of millions of individuals efficiently, or whether coordination failures are common and require correction, and whether the behaviour that is rational for individuals is also rational for society, or whether there are systematic conflicts between private incentives and public welfare. The paradox also raises ethical and philosophical issues, because if individual virtue can produce collective harm, then the relationship between ethics and outcomes becomes more complex. The action that seems right from a personal perspective may contribute to suffering when widely practiced, and this suggests that moral evaluation cannot focus solely on individual actions, but must also consider systemic effects, the ways that individual choices aggregate into social outcomes, and whether there are actions that are permissible or even obligatory for individuals, but disastrous if universally adopted. The paradox of thrift connects to issues of time preference and uncertainty, because saving reflects a preference for future consumption over present consumption, a willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future security. And this preference varies across individuals and across time, influenced by expectations about the future, by confidence in economic stability, by the availability of social insurance and safety nets. And when uncertainty increases, people tend to save more as a precaution. And this precautionary saving can trigger the paradox, can cause the very economic instability that people are trying to protect themselves against, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where fear of recession causes recession. The paradox also appears in the context of debt and deleveraging. When households or firms carry high levels of debt, they may all try to reduce their debt burdens simultaneously by saving more and spending less. And this collective deleveraging reduces aggregate demand and can cause a debt deflation spiral where falling prices and incomes make debt burdens even harder to service, leading to defaults and further economic contraction. And this dynamic was central to the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008, periods when the paradox of thrift was not merely a theoretical curiosity, but a lived reality affecting millions of people. Some economists question whether the paradox is genuine or whether it reflects a misunderstanding of economic dynamics, arguing that savings do not disappear from the economy but are channeled into investment. That when people save more, banks have more funds to lend to businesses for productive investments, and these investments create jobs and income, and so in the long run, increased saving leads to increased capital accumulation and higher living standards. And the paradox only appears in the short run, when there is a coordination problem, when the financial system fails to efficiently convert savings into investment, or when there is a liquidity trap where interest rates are already at zero and cannot fall further to stimulate investment. The paradox of thrift remains a central concept in macroeconomics, a reminder that economies are complex systems where individual actions interact in non-obvious ways, where feedback loops and emergent properties can produce outcomes that no one intended or desired, and where the aggregation of individual rationality does not necessarily produce collective rationality. And it stands as a challenge to simplistic economic thinking, to the idea that what is good for one is good for all, to the belief that markets automatically harmonize individual interests with social welfare, and it forces recognition that economic policy cannot be based solely on microeconomic principles, that understanding the economy requires attention to aggregate demand, to expectations and confidence, to the circular flow of income and spending, and to the possibility that individually prudent behaviour can, under certain conditions, create collective disaster. And the paradox lingers as a warning that virtue is context-dependent, that actions are not good or bad in themselves, but only in relation to the circumstances in which they occur and the effects they produce, and that the attempt to secure individual futures through increased saving can, paradoxically, undermine those futures by damaging the economy on which everyone depends. The phantom limb. Paradox: why missing body parts still feel present. A soldier loses an arm in combat. The limb is amputated, no longer exists, no longer is connected to the body, and yet the soldier feels the arm, feels it present, feels sensations in fingers that are not there, feels the arm moving, feels it itching, feels pain in the missing hand. And this sensation is vivid, is compelling, is indistinguishable from sensations in real limbs. And this is the phantom limb phenomenon experienced by the vast majority of amputees, where missing body parts continue to be felt, continue to be represented in consciousness. And the paradox is that the brain maintains a representation of a limb that no longer exists, continues to generate sensations attributed to that limb, continues to include it in the body schema, despite clear evidence from vision and from direct inspection that the limb is absent. And this persistence reveals something deep about how the brain constructs body representations, shows that body schemas are not simply reflections of current physical structure, but are neural constructs that can outlive the body parts they represent. And phantom limbs demonstrate that the sense of embodiment is generated centrally, is maintained by brain processes that do not require peripheral input. And the phenomenon raises questions about the relationship between body and brain, about how sensations are localized, about what it means for a body part to be yours when that part no longer exists. Imagine the experience from the inside. You lost your hand months ago. The physical hand is gone, and yet you feel it. Feel the fingers, can feel yourself making a fist, opening the hand, moving fingers that are not there. And these phantom movements feel exactly like real movements, involve the same motor intentions, the same kinesthetic sensations. And sometimes the phantom hand is in uncomfortable positions, cramped or twisted, and you cannot move it, cannot relieve the discomfort. And this frozen phantom is intensely frustrating, is painful, because you feel the limb but cannot control it, cannot adjust it, and the pain is real, is neurological, is generated by the brain but is felt as coming from the missing hand. And this localization is puzzling because there is no hand, no physical location where the sensations could be occurring, and yet the sensations are localized there, are felt as arising from a specific spatial location that happens to be empty. The phantom limb phenomenon reveals that body representations are maintained in the somatosensory cortex, in the motor cortex, in the parietal lobe, and these representations do not simply disappear when a limb is removed, do not automatically update to reflect the new body configuration, and instead the neural circuitry that represented the limb continues to be active, continues to generate activity patterns that are interpreted as sensations in the missing limb, and this persistent activity is what creates phantom sensations, is what maintains the feeling of presence and understanding. This has led to treatments, has led to therapies that attempt to reorganize the somatosensory cortex, to reduce phantom pain by providing feedback that the limb is gone, and mirror therapy, where amputees use mirrors to create the visual illusion that the missing limb is present, has proven effective, helps reduce pain and unfreeze frozen phantoms by providing visual feedback that allows the brain to update its body representation. Visualize the somatosensory cortex as containing a map of the body, a homunculus where different regions represent different body parts, and this map is established during development, is maintained throughout life, and when a limb is amputated, the corresponding region of cortex does not simply go silent, does not become inactive, and instead neighbouring regions begin to invade, begin to colonize the deferented cortex, and inputs from the face or from the remaining arm begin to activate what was formerly hand cortex. And this reorganization is rapid, occurs within weeks and creates strange effects. Touching the face can produce sensations in the phantom hand. Stroking the cheek can feel like stroking the missing fingers. And this shows that the cortical representation has been invaded, that face inputs now activate hand cortex, and the sensations are still localized to the phantom because the activity occurs in hand cortex, and the brain interprets activity in hand cortex as indicating sensations in the hand regardless of the actual source of the activity. The phantom limb paradox challenges the idea that sensations are simply caused by peripheral stimulation, shows that sensations can be generated centrally, can arise from brain activity without corresponding peripheral events. And this has implications for understanding pain, for recognizing that pain is not simply a signal from damaged tissue, but is a constructed experience that can occur without tissue damage and chronic pain. Phantom pain, neuropathic pain are all examples of centrally generated sensations, are pains that arise from neural processes rather than from peripheral injury. And understanding phantom limbs helps understand these pain conditions, helps develop treatments that target the central nervous system rather than the periphery. The phenomenon also raises philosophical questions about the extended mind, about whether the body is part of the mind or is merely a tool used by the mind, and phantom limbs suggest that the body representation is part of the mind, is a core component of self-representation, and the representation persists even when the body part is gone. And this shows that the mind includes representations of the body, includes body schemas that are not simply passive reflections of physical structure, but are active constructs that shape experience. And the phantom limb is a representation without a referent, is a body part in the mind, but not in the world. And this dissociation shows that minds represent bodies, and representations can outlive what they represent. One variant of phantom limbs occurs in congenital amputees, people born without limbs, and some congenitally limbless individuals report phantom limbs, report feeling limbs they never had. And this is surprising, suggests that body schemas are not entirely learned, are not simply acquired through experience with actual body parts, but have some innate component, are partly specified by genetic programs that establish expected body structure. And when these programs run, they generate representations of limbs, even when those limbs never existed. And this shows that body schemas are not simply empirical generalizations from sensory experience, but are structured expectations about what bodies should be like. And the brain generates these representations even in the absence of corresponding body parts. Another implication concerns prosthetics, because if phantom limbs persist, if amputees continue to feel missing limbs, then prosthetics should be designed to interface with these phantom sensations, should provide feedback that is integrated with the phantom, and neuroprosthetics that read motor intentions from the brain or from remaining nerves can be controlled by the phantom, can allow amputees to move prosthetic limbs by moving their phantom limbs. And this creates a seamless interface, allows natural control, and the phantom limb, rather than being a problem, becomes a solution, becomes the interface between brain and prosthetic. And understanding phantoms has been crucial for developing advanced prosthetics that feel natural, that are experienced as extensions of the body rather than as external tools. The phantom also appears in other contexts: phantom breasts after mastectomy, phantom genitalia after surgery, phantom teeth after extraction, and all these phantoms reflect the same underlying mechanism, the persistence of neural representations after the represented body parts are removed. And the generality of the phenomenon shows that it is not specific to limbs, but applies to any body part. And body schemas for all body parts can persist as phantoms. And this universality suggests that phantoms reveal a general principle about how brains construct body representations, how these representations are maintained centrally, and how they can become dissociated from physical reality. The amputee feels the hand, phantom fingers that are not there, phantom movements that cannot occur, phantom pain in a location that does not exist, and the paradox persists. The brain maintains a representation despite the absence of the represented, and phantom limbs reveal that bodies are represented in brains, that these representations are stable, are resistant to updating, are constructed during development and maintained throughout life, and removal of body parts does not remove their representations, and the phantom remains, felt but not present, localized but not located, moving but motionless, and the paradox endures as one of the most striking phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that consciousness includes representations that can outlive their reference, that sensations can be generated centrally without peripheral causes, and that the body we feel is not simply the body we have, but is the body the brain represents. And sometimes these diverge and phantoms emerge, ghostly presences of absent limbs, and the phenomenon persists. The paradox of choice, why having everything makes us want nothing. A shopper stands in the cereal aisle of a modern supermarket, surrounded by hundreds of options, dozens of brands, each offering multiple varieties, chocolate cereals and fruit cereals and granola and organic options and sugar-free options and high-fiber options. And the shopper came with a simple goal, to buy cereal, but now faces a wall of choices, and minutes pass. Then more minutes, as the shopper reads labels, compares prices, weighs nutritional content against taste preferences, and the simple task becomes exhausting, becomes overwhelming, and eventually the shopper either picks something randomly just to escape the aisle, or leaves without buying anything at all, paralyzed by too many options. And this is the paradox of choice, articulated by psychologist Barry Schwartz. The observation that while having some choice is better than having none, having too many choices can actually make us worse off, can lead to decision paralysis, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and regret. And this paradox challenges the assumption that more freedom and more options always lead to better outcomes, suggests instead that there is an optimal amount of choice beyond which additional options become burdensome rather than beneficial. Imagine living in a world with few choices, a small village where there is one type of bread, one kind of shoe, limited options for occupation and lifestyle, and people generally wear what everyone wears, eat what everyone eats, follow the paths that tradition provides. And this limited choice can feel constraining, can prevent people from finding what truly suits them, can force them into roles and lifestyles that do not fit, but it also simplifies life, reduces the cognitive burden of decision-making, provides clear social scripts and expectations, and people in such societies often report high satisfaction because expectations are managed, because the gap between what they have and what they could have is small. And now contrast this with modern, affluent societies where choice proliferates endlessly, where every decision, from what to eat for breakfast to what career to pursue, involves navigating vast option spaces. And while this freedom allows for personalization, allows people to find exactly what they want, it also creates anxiety, creates the constant question of whether a better option exists, whether the choice made was optimal. And this anxiety erodes satisfaction even when the chosen option is good, because the existence of unchosen alternatives haunts a decision. The paradox operates through several psychological mechanisms. First is decision paralysis. When faced with too many options, the cognitive load of evaluating them becomes overwhelming. And rather than carefully comparing all options, people either make hasty decisions to escape the complexity or defer the decision entirely, avoid choosing at all. And this is why offering more product varieties can sometimes decrease sales, why adding options can reduce rather than increase engagement, because each additional option adds to the burden of decision making, and at some point the burden exceeds the benefit and people opt out. Second is regret and second guessing. When there are many options and you choose one, The existence of all the unchosen options creates opportunity for regret, creates the thought that perhaps one of the other options would have been better, and this regret is stronger when there are more alternatives because each alternative represents a path not taken, a potential source of better outcomes. And so the chosen option must compete not just with reality, but with imagination, with idealized versions of what the unchosen options might have provided, and actual outcomes rarely exceed these idealized counterfactuals. And so satisfaction decreases even when the choice is good, and this effect is amplified when choices are reversible, when you can change your mind, because reversibility keeps all options perpetually open, prevents commitment, prevents the psychological closure that comes from accepting a decision as final. Third is the escalation of expectations. When there are few options, we expect less. We accept what is available and feel grateful if it is good. But when there are many options, we expect to find exactly what we want, expect the perfect fit, and our standards rise. And this rising threshold means that good outcomes feel merely adequate rather than excellent. And satisfaction depends not on absolute quality, but on the gap between expectations and reality. And more choice raises expectations faster than it improves outcomes. And so, the net effect is decreased satisfaction, despite better products and more freedom. Visualize a graph with number of options on one axis and satisfaction on the other. And the relationship is not linear, but inverted U-shaped. Satisfaction rises as options increase from 0 to some moderate number, perhaps 5 or 10, because having some choice allows people to find something that fits their preferences. But beyond that optimal point, satisfaction begins to decline. And at very high numbers of options, satisfaction may even fall below the level experienced with minimal choice, because the cognitive and emotional costs of choosing exceed the benefits of additional options. And this inverted U captures the paradox, shows that more is not always better, that optimization requires moderation, that there is such a thing as too much freedom. The paradox has practical implications for product design, marketing, and policy. Companies that offer too many products may overwhelm customers and reduce sales, while companies that curate their offerings, that limit choice to a manageable set of high-quality options, may increase satisfaction and loyalty. And this is why successful brands often limit their product lines, why Apple offers relatively few models compared to competitors, why some restaurants have short menus. The limitation is not a failure, but a strategy, a recognition that customers benefit from being protected from too much choice, from having the decision space narrowed by experts who have already done the filtering. The paradox also affects personal life and well-being. Modern individuals face an unprecedented number of choices about identity, lifestyle, career, relationships, and consumption. And while this freedom is liberating in principle, in practice it can be exhausting, can create a sense of being overwhelmed, can generate anxiety about missing out on better options, and research shows that people in societies with more choice are not necessarily happier, that reported life satisfaction has not increased proportionally with the explosion of options, and some argue it has decreased, that the paradox of choice contributes to rising rates of anxiety and depression, that the burden of constructing a life from infinite options without clear guidance is a source of modern malaise. One response to the paradox is to adopt satisficing rather than maximizing as a decision strategy. Maximizers seek the best option, the optimal choice, and this requires evaluating all possibilities, comparing exhaustively, and the process is endless because there is always the possibility that a better option exists somewhere. While satisficers set a threshold of good enough and choose the first option that meets that threshold, and satisficers experience less stress, less regret, and higher satisfaction because they commit to good options without torturing themselves about whether better options exist. And embracing satisficing is a way to opt out of the paradox, to limit self-imposed choice burden even when external options are numerous. Another response is to establish routines and defaults, to make decisions once and then follow the decision automatically in the future, to reduce the number of active choices required. And this is why successful people often simplify their lives, wear the same clothes every day, eat the same breakfast, follow the same schedule, not because they lack creativity, but because they recognize that decision-making is a limited resource, that every choice consumes cognitive energy, and preserving that energy for important decisions requires eliminating trivial choices through routinization. A third response is to embrace constraints, to deliberately limit options, to refuse to consider all possibilities, and this might involve setting rules like, I only shop at this store, or I only consider jobs in this city. And these self-imposed constraints reduce the choice space, make decisions more manageable, and paradoxically increase freedom by preventing paralysis, by ensuring that decisions get made rather than deferred indefinitely. And constraints are not limitations on freedom, but conditions for effective exercise of freedom, structures that enable choice rather than preventing it. The shopper stands in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by options, and eventually walks away empty-handed or grabs something arbitrarily, and the experience is repeated across modern life, in career choices and relationship decisions and consumption patterns, and the paradox persists. More choice leading to less satisfaction, more freedom creating more anxiety. And Schwartz's insight remains relevant, challenges the ideology of unlimited choice, suggests that well-being requires moderation, requires protection from too much optionality, and the paradox endures as a reminder that freedom is complex, that having options is valuable, but that value has limits, that beyond a certain point additional options become burdens rather than benefits. And the challenge for individuals and societies is to find the optimal level of choice, the sweet spot where there is enough freedom to allow for genuine self-determination, but not so much that the burden of choosing overwhelms the benefit of having chosen. And the paradox remains a feature of modern affluent societies, a price paid for abundance, and a problem that requires not more choice but wiser choice, not more options but better frameworks for navigating options. And the cereal aisle waits, endless and overwhelming, and the shopper eventually learns to bring a list to decide in advance, to opt out of the paradox by refusing to treat every shopping trip as an opportunity for exhaustive optimization. The paradox of non-being, how nothing cannot be talked about. A philosopher attempts to state a simple truth, attempts to say that something does not exist, attempts to assert that unicorns are not real, that they have no being, that they are nothing, and yet stating this seems impossible, seems paradoxical, because to say that unicorns do not exist is to say something about unicorns, is to refer to them, to make them the subject of a statement. And how can you refer to what does not exist? How can you make something the subject of a statement if that something is nothing, if it has no being? And if you can refer to unicorns, then they must be something, must have some kind of being. But then the statement unicorns do not exist is false, is contradictory, because it refers to things that it claims do not exist. And this is the paradox of non-being, first articulated by Plato in the Sophist, the puzzle about how negative existential statements are possible, how we can truly say that something does not exist without contradicting ourselves, without presupposing the existence of what we are denying exists. And this paradox has troubled metaphysics throughout history, has generated multiple solutions, and remains a test case for theories of reference and existence. Imagine trying to deny the existence of something, trying to say that Zeus does not exist, that there is no such God, and the statement seems straightforward, seems obviously true, but analysing the statement reveals problems because the statement is about Zeus, makes Zeus the subject, and subjects of statements must be something, must have reference, must be objects that the statement is about. And if Zeus is the subject, then Zeus must exist in some sense, must be something rather than nothing, but the statement says Zeus does not exist, says Zeus is nothing, and so the statement seems self-refuting, seems to both presuppose and deny the existence of its subject. And this is the paradox, that negative existentials, statements denying existence, seem impossible to state without contradiction. Parmenides made this paradox central to his philosophy, argued that non-being cannot be spoken of or thought about, because speaking and thinking require objects, require that there be something that is spoken of or thought about, and non-being is not something, is nothing, and so non-being is inexpressible, unthinkable, and from this Parmenides concluded that non-being does not exist, that everything that is exists, that reality is one unchanging being, and change is impossible because change would require something to come into being from non-being or to pass into non-being, and both are impossible. And this radical conclusion follows from taking the paradox of non-being seriously, from accepting that we cannot coherently speak of what does not exist. Visualize the paradox as a linguistic trap. When you say X does not exist, you seem to refer to X, and reference requires that X be something, and if X is something, then X exists. And so the statement is self-refuting, and yet negative existentials seem to be true, seem to be among the most basic truths. And we need to explain how they can be true without contradiction, how we can deny existence without presupposing it. And this requires a theory of reference that allows reference to non-existence, or that reinterprets negative existentials so they do not really refer to their apparent subjects. One solution proposed by Russell denies that names like Zeus refer to objects, analyzes them as disguised descriptions, and Zeus does not exist becomes, there is no unique object that has all the properties attributed to Zeus in mythology. And this existential statement does not refer to Zeus, does not presuppose any object, but simply denies that the description is satisfied. And this allows negative existentials to be true, without paradox, without reference to non-existence. And Russell's theory of descriptions has been widely adopted as solving the paradox, as showing that negative existentials do not actually have the logical form they appear to have, do not refer to their apparent subjects. Another solution from free logic distinguishes between existence and reference, allows that terms can refer without presupposing existence, and negative existentials are statements that deny existence while preserving reference, and this requires revising classical logic, requires allowing that some terms refer to nothing, are empty names, and statements containing empty names can still be meaningful, can still have truth values. And Zeus does not exist is true because Zeus is an empty name, refers to nothing, and the statement denies existence without presupposing it. And free logic has been developed extensively, provides formal semantics for empty names, and handles the paradox by liberalizing logic to allow reference without existence. A third solution, from Meinongian approaches, accepts that non-existent objects are real in a broad sense, have being even if they lack existence, and Zeus does not exist is true, because Zeus is a non-existent object, has being but lacks existence, and statements about Zeus refer to this non-existent object, and the paradox is dissolved because reference does not require existence, only requires being, and non-existent objects have being, have properties, can be subjects of true statements, and this solution preserves the intuition that negative existentials refer to their subjects, while denying that reference requires existence. The paradox also appears in discussions of nothingness, of absolute non-being, because to say that absolute nothing is impossible seems to require referring to absolute nothing, making it the subject of a statement, and if it is the subject then it must be something. And so the statement that nothing is impossible presupposes that nothing is something. And this generates contradiction, and Heidegger made this paradox central to his philosophy, explored the nature of nothingness, argued that nothing is not a thing, but is the horizon of being, the possibility of non-being that makes being intelligible. And discussing nothing requires special language, requires recognizing that nothing is not an object, but is something more fundamental. And the paradox shows limits of ordinary language, shows that metaphysics pushes language beyond its designed capacities. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, accept that there are true contradictions, dialetheas, statements that are both true and false, and negative existentials are examples, are both true because they correctly deny existence, and false because they refer to their subjects, and reference presupposes existence. And this paraconsistent approach accepts contradiction, develops logics that allow true contradictions without explosion, without allowing everything to be provable. And while controversial, paraconsistent logic provides one way of handling the paradox, accepts that negative existentials are genuinely paradoxical, are both true and false. The statement stands: Zeus does not exist, unicorns are not real, nothing is something, and the paradox remains, hovering over negative existentials, challenging theories of reference, forcing recognition that denying existence is not as simple as it seems. That we cannot straightforwardly say that something is nothing without creating logical tension, and the paradox of non-being endures as one of the oldest problems in philosophy, a problem recognized by Plato, central to Parmenides, unresolved by centuries of analysis. And various solutions exist, various ways of dissolving or accepting the paradox, but no consensus emerges, and the paradox persists, a reminder that language struggles to express non-existence, that negation creates puzzles, and that the boundary between being and non-being resists clear articulation. The paradox of tolerance, when being open-minded means destroying open-mindedness. A liberal society values tolerance, values the freedom to believe different things, to practice different religions, to hold different political views, to live in different ways. And this tolerance is seen as a virtue, as essential to freedom and democracy, as the foundation of peaceful coexistence in diverse societies. And the principle seems clear: we should tolerate all views and practices, should allow maximum freedom, should not suppress beliefs or ways of life just because we disagree with them. And yet a problem emerges, a paradox first articulated clearly by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, which asks what a tolerant society should do when faced with intolerance, when confronted by movements that reject tolerance itself, that seek to destroy the open society and replace it with authoritarianism, that demand the right to spread hate and silence opposition. And if the tolerant society tolerates these intolerant movements, if it grants them freedom to organize and spread their views, then the intolerant movements will eventually gain power and destroy tolerance itself, will shut down free speech, will persecute minorities, will end democracy, and the tolerant society will have tolerated itself out of existence. And this is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the destruction of tolerance, that to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to be intolerant toward intolerance, to refuse to tolerate those who would destroy tolerance. Imagine a democracy where free speech is protected, where all political views are allowed, where movements can organize and campaign and attempt to win power through elections. And now, imagine a fascist movement that explicitly rejects democracy, that promises to seize power and end elections and establish dictatorship. And this movement uses the freedoms of the democratic system to grow, uses free speech to spread propaganda, uses freedom of assembly to recruit followers, uses democratic procedures to gain seats in parliament, and at each stage, the democratic society faces a choice. Do we tolerate this movement? Do we allow it to continue operating within the system, even though its goal is to destroy the system? Or do we suppress it? Do we ban the movement, arrest its leaders, prevent it from spreading its message? And if we suppress it, are we betraying our own principles? Are we becoming intolerant ourselves? And if we do not suppress it, are we complicit in our own destruction? Are we naive? Are we allowing democracy to commit suicide? Popper's answer was that we should not tolerate the intolerant, that tolerance is not a suicide pact, that a society that wishes to remain tolerant must be willing to defend itself against movements that seek to destroy tolerance, and this means that tolerance has limits, that it does not extend to those who would abuse it to eliminate tolerance. And Popper acknowledged that this is paradoxical, that the tolerant society must practice intolerance, must suppress certain views, must limit freedom in order to preserve freedom. But he argued that this is necessary, that the alternative is the death of tolerance, and history supports this. Societies that tolerated fascist movements in the 1920s and 1930s saw those movements seize power and establish brutal dictatorships. And the lesson is that tolerance must be defended, that it cannot be absolute, that there are views and movements that cannot be accommodated within a free society because their goal is to end freedom. But this creates difficult questions about where to draw the line, about which views count as intolerably intolerant, about who decides, about what methods of suppression are legitimate. Because if we ban every movement that seems threatening, if we suppress every view that makes us uncomfortable, then we are no longer a tolerant society. We have become the oppressors. We have done the work of the intolerant for them. And so the paradox is not fully resolved by saying we should not tolerate intolerance, because we need principles to determine what counts as intolerance. What level of threat justifies suppression, and whether suppression means banning speech, banning organizations, arresting people, or merely refusing to engage, refusing to give platforms, refusing to treat intolerant views as legitimate options in public debate. Visualize a spectrum of intolerance. On one end are views that are merely offensive or unpopular, views that challenge prevailing norms, views that make some people uncomfortable. And these views, even if we find them objectionable, should be tolerated in a free society, should be allowed to be expressed and debated, because tolerance means accepting that people will hold views we dislike. And suppressing offensive views is censorship, is the tyranny of the majority, is the opposite of the tolerance we claim to value. And on the other end of the spectrum are movements that actively seek to destroy democratic institutions, that incite violence, that organize to strip rights from minorities, that threaten the basic conditions of a free society. And these movements, Popper argues, need not be tolerated, can be suppressed to protect the tolerant society. But the middle of the spectrum is murky, filled with cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a movement or view crosses the line. And this is where the paradox bites hardest, where we must make judgments without clear rules, where any decision risks either tolerating too much and allowing intolerance to grow, or suppressing too much and becoming intolerant ourselves. Some philosophers argue that the paradox can be resolved through procedural rules, through formal commitments to democratic processes. A tolerant society tolerates all views that accept the democratic framework, that agree to compete peacefully for power, that accept the results of elections and respect the rights of others. But it does not tolerate movements that reject these procedures, that seek power through violence or intimidation, that refuse to accept electoral defeat. And this procedural approach provides a clear line. Tolerance extends to those who play by the rules, not to those who seek to overturn the rules. But critics note that even this approach involves substantive value judgments, because the democratic framework itself embodies values like equality and freedom. And so we are saying we tolerate all views except those that reject our core values. And this is not neutral tolerance, but partisan tolerance, tolerance of a specific range of views that we have already deemed acceptable. Others argue that the solution involves distinguishing between tolerating views and tolerating actions, that a truly tolerant society allows people to hold and express any beliefs, but does not allow them to act on beliefs that harm others, So expressing racist views might be tolerated, but discriminatory actions are not. Advocating for dictatorship might be tolerated, but attempting a coup is not. And this distinction seems to preserve free thought and speech while preventing harm, but it faces difficulties because speech can cause harm, hate speech can incite violence, propaganda can radicalize people, and drawing the line between harmless expression and harmful action is not straightforward. And some argue that by the time intolerant movements act, it may be too late, that tolerant societies must suppress intolerant speech before it metastasizes into intolerant action. The paradox also has a psychological dimension, because tolerating intolerance is emotionally difficult, requires accepting that people will spread views you find abhorrent, will organize against values you hold dear, will seek to undermine the society you want to preserve. And this acceptance is painful, creates tension, and there is a constant temptation to suppress, to silence, to refuse to tolerate, and distinguishing between legitimate suppression of genuine threats and illegitimate censorship of mere disagreement requires judgment, requires resisting the urge to label all opposing views as intolerable, requires humility about our own fallibility, and these are difficult virtues to maintain, especially in polarized times when every political disagreement feels existential. The tolerant society stands at the edge, welcoming diverse views, protecting freedom, and watching as intolerant movements test the boundaries, push the limits, demand the right to destroy the very system that protects them. And the society must decide, must draw a line, must say some things cannot be tolerated, some movements cannot be accommodated. And in drawing that line, the society becomes less than perfectly tolerant, accepts that tolerance has limits, that the open society must defend itself. And the paradox does not disappear, but is managed, lived with, navigated through judgment and vigilance. And Popper's warning echoes: unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, and so tolerance must be limited, must exclude those who would destroy it. And this is not a betrayal of tolerance, but its preservation. Not a contradiction, but a recognition that all principles have boundaries, that values must be defended, and that the truly tolerant society is one that tolerates everything except intolerance. And the paradox remains, uncomfortable and unresolved, a permanent feature of liberal democracy, a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be actively maintained, and that tolerance, for all its virtues, is not enough by itself, must be supplemented with vigilance, with judgment, with the willingness to say no, to draw lines, to defend the open society against those who would close it. And the tension persists, always present, always requiring balance, and the paradox endures. The paradox of confirmation. Why seeing a red apple proves all ravens are black. A scientist seeks to confirm the hypothesis that all ravens are black, and the obvious way to test this hypothesis is to observe ravens, to find ravens and check their colour. And each black raven found provides evidence for the hypothesis, confirms it slightly, makes it more likely to be true. And this seems straightforward, seems like basic scientific method. Observe instances that match the hypothesis and they provide confirmation. But philosopher Carl Hempel noticed something strange, something that reveals how confirmation works in unexpected ways. And the strangeness begins with a logical equivalence. The statement, all ravens are black, is logically equivalent to the statement, all non-black things are non-ravens. These two statements have exactly the same truth conditions. If one is true, then the other must be true. If one is false, then the other must be false. And so anything that confirms one statement should confirm the other, should provide equal evidence for both. But now consider what confirms the statement. All non-black things are non-ravens, and observing a non-black non-raven should confirm it. Observing a red apple provides evidence that all non-black things are non-ravens because a red apple is non-black and is a non-raven. And since all non-black things are non-ravens is equivalent to all ravens are black. observing a red apple should confirm that all ravens are black. And this seems absurd. Seems like observing apples in your kitchen has nothing to do with the colour of ravens. And yet the logic is impeccable. And this is the paradox of confirmation, also called Hempel's paradox or the raven paradox. A puzzle about how evidence works, about what confirms scientific hypotheses, and about whether our intuitions about confirmation can be trusted. Imagine a scientist sitting in a laboratory surrounded by red apples, carefully noting each one, recording that it is red and not a raven, and claiming that this investigation provides evidence about ravens, evidence that all ravens are black. And this seems ridiculous. Seems like the scientist has confused what is relevant to the hypothesis, has mistaken irrelevant observations for genuine evidence, and yet the logical structure is clear. Each red apple confirms that all non-black things are non-ravens, and this statement is logically equivalent to all ravens are black. And confirmation should be closed under logical equivalence. If observation O confirms hypothesis H, and H is equivalent to H, then O should confirm H out, otherwise confirmation would depend on how we phrase hypotheses rather than on what they say. And so the scientist with the red apples is doing legitimate science, is confirming a hypothesis about ravens even though no ravens are involved. And the paradox forces us to either accept this counterintuitive conclusion or reject some principle we thought was obvious about how confirmation works. The paradox reveals tension between formal logic and intuitive judgment. Because formally the argument is valid, red apples do confirm that all ravens are black through the equivalence with all non-black things are non-ravens, but intuitively this seems wrong. Seems like red apples are irrelevant to ravens, and resolving this tension requires either explaining why the formal conclusion is actually correct and our intuitions are misleading, or showing where the formal argument goes wrong, where a principle we thought was valid actually fails. And both options have been pursued, have generated extensive philosophical literature, have produced multiple proposed solutions, none of which has won universal acceptance. Visualize the logical space of all objects, divided into 4 categories: black ravens, which confirm the hypothesis directly; non-black ravens, which would falsify the hypothesis; black non-ravens like coal or blackboards, which seem irrelevant; and non-black non-ravens like red apples, which also seem irrelevant. And the paradox says that observing objects in the 4th category, non-black non-ravens, provides evidence for the hypothesis that all ravens are black, because these observations confirm the equivalent hypothesis that all non-black things are non-ravens, and each red apple, each green leaf, each blue car provides a tiny bit of evidence that ravens are black. And while this sounds absurd, it follows from principles of confirmation that seem undeniable. One proposed solution appeals to background knowledge and prior probabilities, argues that red apples do confirm that all ravens are black, but the confirmation is so tiny as to be practically negligible. Because we have vast background knowledge about the number of non-black things in the universe, we know there are billions and billions of non-black objects, and observing one red apple increases our confidence that all non-black things are non-ravens by an infinitesimal amount, whereas we have much less background knowledge about ravens, and observing one black raven increases our confidence that all ravens are black by a larger amount. And so both observations provide confirmation, but in vastly different degrees. And this explains why it seems pointless to observe red apples when investigating raven colour. Not because they provide no confirmation, but because they provide so little confirmation that the exercise is worthless. And this Bayesian solution preserves the formal logic while explaining the intuition, accepts that red apples confirm the hypothesis, but explains why we correctly ignore them. Another solution challenges the equivalence condition, argues that confirmation is not closed under logical equivalence, that logically equivalent statements can receive different confirmation from the same observation. And the reason is that confirmation depends not just on logical form, but on the way hypotheses are stated, on which predicates are used, on how the hypothesis carves up the world, and all ravens are black, and all non-black things are non-ravens, while logically equivalent, organise the world differently, make different predicates primary, and observations confirm hypotheses relative to these organisations, and a black raven confirms the first hypothesis more than the second, and a red apple confirms the second more than the first, even though they are equivalent. And this solution rejects the principle that equivalent hypotheses must receive equal confirmation from the same observation. A third solution appeals to selective confirmation, argues that observing a red apple provides some evidence for all ravens are black, but only under certain conditions, only when the observation is made in a context where it has the potential to falsify the hypothesis, and seeing a red apple in your kitchen where you never expected to find a raven provides no confirmation, provides no new information, but seeing a red apple in a context where you might have found a non-black raven, where the observation had the potential to reveal a counterexample, does provide confirmation. And so confirmation depends not just on what is observed, but on the circumstances of observation, on what was at stake, on what alternatives were possible. And this solution ties confirmation to potential falsification, treats confirmation as depending on whether observations eliminate possibilities rather than merely matching hypotheses. The paradox also connects to the problem of induction, to Hume's problem of how we can justify inferring from observed instances to unobserved cases, because confirming all ravens are black by observing black ravens assumes that the future will resemble the past, that unobserved ravens will be like observed ravens, and this assumption itself cannot be justified without circularity. And the paradox adds another layer, shows that even if we accept induction, we face puzzles about what counts as confirming evidence, about whether observations of non-ravens can tell us about ravens, and these puzzles reveal that confirmation is more complex than it appears, cannot be reduced to simple pattern matching or accumulation of positive instances. The scientist with the red apples continues recording, carefully noting each observation, and the paradox hangs over the investigation, a question about whether this absurd procedure is actually legitimate science, whether red apples really do provide evidence about ravens, and the answer depends on how we understand confirmation, on which principles we accept, on whether we follow formal logic or intuitive judgment, and the paradox remains unresolved in the sense that different solutions appeal to different intuitions, make different trade-offs, and no consensus has emerged, only a recognition that confirmation is subtle, that evidence works in non-obvious ways, that formal principles can lead to counterintuitive conclusions, and that the relationship between observation and theory, between data and hypothesis, between evidence and confirmation, is more complex than common sense suggests, and Hempel's paradox endures as a classic problem in philosophy of science, a puzzle that continues to challenge our understanding of scientific method, a reminder that even basic concepts like confirmation and evidence conceal difficulties that philosophy has not fully resolved. The paradox of the court, when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case, and the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition. And second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case. And according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case. And so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay. And second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case. And according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case. And so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment. And this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable. Not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay. And these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce, and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere. And this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction. and impossible contracts are unenforceable. And so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy, and the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction. The paradox of the ravens, yet another formulation of Hempel's problem. The paradox appears under multiple names because different philosophers have formulated it independently or emphasized different aspects. And the paradox of the ravens is essentially identical to the paradox of confirmation and to the raven paradox, all referring to Hempel's discovery that observing non-black non-ravens logically confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And this formulation emphasizes the ravens themselves, emphasizes that the hypothesis is about a specific class of objects, ravens, and yet evidence can come from observing completely different objects, apples and shoes and clouds, and the paradoxical nature lies in this disconnect between what the hypothesis is about and what confirms it, between the subject matter and the evidence, and calling it the paradox of the ravens highlights this strange relationship, makes explicit that ravens are the subject of the hypothesis, but need not be the subject of confirming observations. The multiplicity of names reflects the paradox's importance, its centrality to philosophy of science, because a problem this fundamental is rediscovered repeatedly, is approached from different angles, and each formulation brings slightly different emphasis, highlights different aspects of the puzzle, and some formulations focus on confirmation theory, on the formal logic of evidence, while others focus on scientific practice, on what scientists actually do when testing hypotheses, and still others focus on intuitions, on the clash between logical conclusions and common sense judgments. And all these perspectives are valuable, all contribute to understanding the paradox, and the proliferation of names is a sign of the paradox's richness, its ability to raise questions at multiple levels, from technical issues in confirmation theory to broad questions about scientific method. The paradox also connects to debates about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches to statistics and inference, because Bayesians have a ready answer to the paradox, can explain using Bayes' theorem why red apples confirm that all ravens are black, but provide only negligible confirmation, while frequentists struggle more, find it harder to explain the asymmetry between observing ravens and observing non-ravens. And this has led some philosophers to see the raven paradox as evidence for Bayesianism, as showing that Bayesian methods are better equipped to handle confirmation than classical approaches, though others argue that the paradox is not decisive, that various approaches can accommodate it with appropriate modifications. The paradox remains a standard topic in philosophy curricula, a problem that every student encounters. And despite its age, despite being formulated in the 1940s, it continues to generate discussion, continues to appear in new papers and books, because it is simple enough to explain quickly, deep enough to sustain extended analysis, and challenging enough that no solution is universally accepted. And this combination makes it pedagogically valuable and philosophically important, a paradox that serves both as an introduction to philosophy of science and as a topic for advanced research. The ravens circle overhead, black against the sky, and each sighting confirms what we already believed, that ravens are black, and elsewhere apples sit in bowls, red and green and yellow. And logic says these two are evidence about ravens, and the paradox persists, a permanent feature of confirmation theory, a problem that every account of scientific reasoning must address. And the paradox endures under its many names, always the same underlying puzzle, always the same challenge to explain how evidence works, what confirms hypotheses, and why common sense and formal logic sometimes diverge. And the paradox of the ravens remains, waiting for each new generation of philosophers to confront it, to propose solutions, to argue about confirmation, and to recognize that even basic concepts in science conceal philosophical depths that resist easy resolution. The paradox of democracy, when majority rule destroys itself. A democratic society values freedom and equality, gives every citizen voice, allows majority rule to determine policy, and this seems just, seems fair, seems like the best system for governance. And yet democracy contains internal tensions, contains paradoxes that threaten its stability, and one fundamental paradox asks, what democracy should do when the majority votes to end democracy? When the people use democratic procedures to elect authoritarian leaders who promise to dismantle democratic institutions? And if democracy respects majority, well, it must allow this outcome, must permit its own destruction. But if democracy forbids this outcome, prevents the majority from choosing authoritarianism, then it violates its own principles, acts undemocratically. And this is the paradox of democracy, the recognition that democracy's commitment to majority rule can lead to outcomes that destroy democracy itself. And navigating this paradox requires balancing competing values, requires defending democracy sometimes against democratic procedures, requires recognizing that procedural democracy is not sufficient, that substantive commitments to rights and freedoms are necessary to preserve democracy. And this paradox has been central to political philosophy since ancient times, was recognized by Plato, who argued that democracy tends toward tyranny, and the paradox remains relevant today as democratic societies face authoritarian movements that use democratic means to gain power. Imagine an election where an authoritarian party campaigns on promises to restrict freedoms, to eliminate checks and balances, to concentrate power, to end future elections, and this party wins a majority, wins through legitimate democratic procedures, through free and fair voting, and now the society faces a choice. Honor the election results and allow democracy to be dismantled, or override the results and preserve democracy by undemocratic means. And neither option is satisfactory. Both involve betraying core democratic values. And the paradox emerges from the fact that democracy values both procedural fairness and substantive freedoms. And these can conflict. Majority rule can threaten minority rights, can threaten the institutions that make democracy possible. And when conflict occurs, democracy faces an impossible choice: preserve procedure or preserve substance, respect majority will or defend fundamental freedoms. The paradox connects to Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, that tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. And the same structure applies to democracy. Unlimited democracy, democracy that respects all majority decisions regardless of content, leads to the disappearance of democracy. And democratic societies must be undemocratic toward anti-democratic movements to preserve democracy, and this creates the paradox. Democracy must violate its principles to preserve its principles, must act undemocratically to remain democratic. And this tension is permanent, is inherent in the structure of democracy, cannot be fully resolved, but must be managed through careful balancing of competing considerations. Visualize democracy as having two aspects: procedural democracy, which emphasizes voting, majority rule, fair elections, and substantive democracy, which emphasizes rights, freedoms, protections for minorities, and ideally these aspects reinforce each other. Procedures protect rights and rights enable procedures, but they can conflict. Procedures can be used to undermine rights, majorities can vote to restrict freedoms, and when conflict occurs, the society must choose which aspect to prioritize, and different societies make different choices. Constitutional democracies emphasize substantive protections, have constitutions that limit majority power, protect fundamental rights even against majority will. And these systems accept that democracy involves more than majority rule, involves commitments to principles that cannot be overridden by votes. And this resolves the paradox partially, makes democracy less purely procedural, more substantively constrained. One response to the paradox argues that true democracy is substantive, not procedural, that democracy is not just about voting, but about respecting rights, protecting minorities, ensuring freedom. And when these substantive commitments are threatened, even by majority vote, democracy requires defending them, requires overriding the majority. And this militant democracy, this democracy that defends itself against anti-democratic forces, is not a betrayal of democracy, but is its preservation, is necessary to maintain the conditions that make democracy possible. And historical examples support this. Societies that failed to restrict anti-democratic movements, that allowed authoritarians to use democratic procedures to gain power, lost their democracies, and hindsight suggests that early intervention, that militant defense would have been justified, would have preserved democracy even though it involved undemocratic means. Another response distinguishes between procedural rules and constitutional principles, argues that democracies should have entrenched principles that cannot be changed by ordinary procedures, that require supermajorities or constitutional amendments, and these entrenched principles include fundamental rights, democratic structures, and protections for minorities. And ordinary majorities can make policy within these constraints, but cannot override the principles themselves. And this response preserves both procedural and substantive democracy, allows majority rule within limits. And the paradox is resolved by recognizing that democracy is hierarchical, has constitutional principles at one level and democratic procedures at another, and procedures operate within the framework set by principles, and this framework is not itself subject to ordinary democratic revision. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that democracy is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable to self-destruction, and argues that this vulnerability is a price worth paying for freedom, that the alternative, restricting democracy to protect democracy, is worse than the risk of democratic collapse, and this radical democratic response trusts in the people, trusts that majorities will not choose their own oppression, and when they do, the society pays the price. And this response is rare. Most societies are unwilling to risk democratic collapse, prefer to impose constraints on democracy, but the response represents one coherent position, one way of resolving the paradox by accepting its consequences. The paradox also appears in debates about hate speech, about whether democracies should allow speech that advocates for the destruction of democracy, speech that promotes authoritarianism or discrimination. And free speech is a democratic value, is protected in democratic societies. But speech that aims to destroy democracy creates the paradox, and banning such speech seems undemocratic, seems to violate free expression, but allowing it risks democracy's survival. And different democracies resolve this differently. Some ban anti-democratic speech, some allow it, and no resolution is without costs. All involve trade-offs between competing values. The election results are counted, the authoritarian party has won, and the democratic society faces the paradox: honour the results and risk losing democracy, or override the results and betray democratic procedures. And the choice is not theoretical, is faced by real societies, has been faced throughout history, and different societies have chosen differently. Some have preserved democracy by undemocratic means, some have respected procedures and lost democracy, and the paradox remains unresolved, remains a permanent tension in democratic governance. A challenge that every democracy must navigate, must balance procedure against substance, must defend itself without betraying itself. And the paradox of democracy endures as a fundamental problem in political philosophy, a recognition that democracy contains contradictions, that majority rule can lead to minority oppression, that freedom can be voted away, and that preserving democracy sometimes requires limiting democracy. And the tension persists. The balance is delicate, and the paradox remains unsolved, a permanent feature of democratic life.